Hi, fifth graders. We are back to talk about the Southern Colonies again, and this time we're going to focus on life in the Southern Colonies. So we're talking about the colonies of Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Maryland. So for this lesson, if we were in like real school, we would be taking notes on some readings that I would have had like posted in fun little cards all around the classroom. So I'm going to do the less exciting thing of kind of talking about the information that's on the cards and then going over how you would have that in note-taking form. And we are going to be focusing on some different topics of like daily life in the Southern Colonies. Okay, so we're going to start with education. And education in the Southern Colonies wasn't as good as the Middle Colonies and New England colonies. And the reason for that is because literacy rates were lower. And that means that literacy means the ability to read and write. So less people knew how to read and write in the Southern colonies than they did in the New England colonies and the Middle colonies. And the reason for that is because the Southern colonies was made up of big plantations. And so people really had to work hard all day to take care of those plantations and raise their crops. But also because they were such large plantations, they were kind of far apart from each other. And you couldn't really have a school that way where a lot of people would attend if it was really far away from a lot of the people who needed to go to school. So they didn't really attend school very much. The other thing that it was tied to was class and gender. So class means like whether you were rich or poor, and then whether you were male or female was the gender part. And so poor farmers or indentured servants usually were not literate. So usually they couldn't read and couldn't write. African slaves were not taught to read and write. Some African slaves found their way around that and were very persistent and figured out ways to do that, but they didn't get the right to be literate, which was part of the horrible nature of slavery. And then women at the time, and this even includes wealthy women, were not literate. So the people, colonial leaders in the Southern colonies didn't feel that women should, they should take the time to teach women to read and write. So basically that leaves those white, affluent or like rich landowners. So, and all men. They were the ones who were literate. They were also the ones, if you remember, who got to vote or hold public office. Some private tutors were hired by wealthy families, and those private tutors would teach their sons, the sons in the family, math and science and reading and history and how to manage the plantation. That was really important. And most of the young men who did this tutoring, had completed their education in England. And so that's why they were able to tutor. Okay, so my notes, if I consider, was education considered a right or a privilege in the Southern colonies? It's definitely considered a privilege. It wasn't everybody's right to have it. Only wealthy males were given a thorough education. They were the only ones who got it. Women, poor people, slaves, and indentured servants were less literate, or they were completely illiterate, meaning they couldn't read or write at all. And the Southern colonists were less literate than colonists in the other 13 colonies. Okay, so those are the notes I would have taken from reading this card that I have in front of me. Now we're going to go to the next one, which is religion. So you can kind of look at the images there about religion in the Southern colonies. So in New England, the religion was the Puritan religion, and we're going to get to that later when we talk about the New England colonies. The Southerners really didn't come to the New World trying to find religious freedom. That wasn't their big goal. Remember, they wanted to find gold and they wanted money. So, the Virginia Company is what started the colony of Virginia, and it was a business. So it was like a way to make money. Maryland was the only one that was a colony started for a religion, because it was started for the Catholics. And then you remember from the last video that even though it started as an all-Catholic colony, they brought in so many indentured servants to work the land, and they were all Protestants. So eventually the Catholics were in the minority, or there were fewer Catholics than other religions. So Puritan servants lived in the Southern colonies too, and they ended up being the majority. But Southern colonists practiced a lot of different religions. So in Virginia, they were Baptists and Anglicans. And Anglicans were from the Church of England. So that's what, like, the Puritans, they were trying to get away from the Church of England. So, but there were like Church of England followers in the Southern colonies. And those Baptists and Anglicans were like at odds with each other. So they disagreed about everything. Colonial ministers, so like the ones in charge of the church, they didn't really have a lot of power in the South. So that was something that was very different, especially very different than England. Wealthy landowners, again, are the ones that had the most power, and they made most of the decisions for all of the colonies, for all the towns in the colonies. And just like school, because the plantations were so far apart, it made it really hard for the people to go to church, because it was so far away. So it was really hard to get a church going where a lot of people would come. But worshipers that did go to church, or that practiced religion, they were from all the social classes. So there were rich people and poor people who practiced religion, but they did separate a little bit, because they usually made slaves sit in a separate part of the church, or they even had a different service altogether, just for slaves. So that's religion. And so if we ask why were the Southern colonies religiously diverse, we did find some evidence of yes, kind of. I mean, there were Catholics, Baptists, Anglicans, and Puritans all there. But all of those religions are Christian religions, so they believe in Christ. And most of them are Protestant religions, okay, except for those Maryland Catholics. So even though there were different religions there, they were all kind of like similar religions. And Puritans were the majority. Like we said before, the Baptists and the Anglicans were kind of at odds with each other, so they didn't really get along. Native Americans and African slaves also practiced religion, and these were non-Christian religions sometimes, so those were some different, diverse religions. But like I said, plantations were so far apart from each other that they didn't really attend church service on a regular basis. People didn't. And slaves were forced to sit separately or go to a completely different service altogether. So diversity definitely not honored in the Southern colonies, but there were some different types of beliefs. Okay, so now plantations. So you've heard a lot about plantations so far. I wanted to give you guys some images of plantations and some other information about plantations, because this was a gigantic part of the Southern colonies, was plantation life. So that Virginia company that started Virginia colony, their goal was to find gold and to make a profit. So they wanted money. And the early colonists didn't find gold. But they did find tobacco, like we talked about in the last video. So the tobacco industry, it kind of structured the whole society of the South because it was grown on these large plantations, which were farms, and it required a lot of people to work on these plantations, lots and lots and lots of workers. So the poor English started to arrive in the Southern colonies, and they all wanted to work as indentured servants so that they could, in 5 to 7 years, they could earn their freedom and then have their own piece of land and make their own farm and their own way of life. In about around 1619, that's when slaves were brought to the Southern colonies, to Virginia specifically, and they got added to the workforce. So the social structure of the Southern colonies, specifically Virginia, was really similar to England. So there was like a small amount of people who were really wealthy and who owned land, these big plantations. And then there was a large population of slaves and servants, indentured servants, that ran everything. They had to do all of the work for these wealthy landowners. So the people at the top, the really wealthy landowners and their families, they enjoyed a lot of freedoms. So they enjoyed things like goods and clothing and nice homes and education, and they had positions of power in the government. People listened to them, they got to vote. And then most of the people who were either servants or slaves, they just had to work for them. They didn't really have any rights in society. So it was a lot of people in the South who really didn't get a say in how things went, or didn't really get to enjoy the freedoms that colonists pursued. So how did the tobacco industry structure Southern society? Growing the tobacco requires large areas of land and many workers. The tobacco industry allowed Southern society to mimic England. So the tobacco industry made it so that the society could be very similar to England, with a large population of workers and slaves and a small population of wealthy landowners. Many of those indentured servants worked on plantations. Some worked inside, but many on the fields. And the wealthy people got to be educated and hold power in the government, and slaves and indentured servants had no rights. So now let's talk about indentured servants and learn a little bit more about them. We talked about how all these plantations meant that there was a big need for a lot of people to work on the fields. So the people in England who were poor became indentured servants. So they wanted to have a better life in the New World, and they made an agreement and signed like a contract, kind of like the one that's in the corner of this slide, where it says this indenture. That's a contract for an indentured servant. And they would agree to work for like 5 to 7 years, and in exchange they would get passage to Virginia. So they would get like a place on a ship to sail to Virginia, and then they would get food and shelter once they arrived there. They would obviously have food and shelter on the ship as well if they survived the journey. And they would work until their service years were up, and then they would get what's called the freedom dues. And usually that was money or goods to begin their new life. So it might be land, it might be money, it might be possessions that they could have to start their new life. Indentured servants in a way were kind of like slaves because they could be bought or sold, and they had to obey their masters. A lot of them were men because they were considered more useful in the fields, and indentured servants, that's where they were wanted most. So when you see indentured servants working in the house, it was usually women. There were diseases like malaria and yellow fever, and so those things ran rampant in the colonies, especially for people who were working hard, long hours, and not being fed well and cared for. They were more susceptible to getting sick. So some indentured servants never even lived long enough to get their freedom. So they would die in their service. Some of the masters were pretty brutal, and they were mean and violent with their servants. The servants had to work really hard and long hours, and they had horrible living conditions. It's not like they were living in the plantation home with the wealthy landowners. They were living in really like not very nice shelters, kind of like little shacks. Some of them would run away because it was so horrible. So even though it wasn't as bad as slavery, it was pretty bad. Okay, so what was life like for an indentured servant? The notes I would take were that most of them came from England's poorest group of people, and their contract lasted 5 to 7 years, and they would get the trip to Virginia, food and shelter in return, that they could be bought or sold, that men were more valuable because they were considered better workers in the fields, that they worked really hard, but a lot of them didn't survive because of malaria and yellow fever, and that if they did survive, they had to get through the difficult, hard work, the bad living conditions, and the sometimes cruel masters. So it was a big achievement to get through indentured servitude. Okay, so now let's talk about slavery. And we talked a lot about slavery when we did our Explorer unit. We talked about the slave trade then. So you guys know quite a bit about this already. But we know that those plantations, that created a great need for indentured servants and for slaves. The thing about slavery is that slaves were not, didn't make an agreement to come over and work in the fields. They were taken by force and against their will. And, the landowners didn't have to give them anything because they were not considered people, really. They were more considered like possessions. So plantation owners started preferring slaves to indentured servants because they got more for their money than what they would get for an indentured servant in their eyes. The journey that slaves had to endure, like we talked about in the exploration unit, was very, very difficult. Many of them died. Those who survived had to be slaves their whole life. There was not a promise of freedom at all. Their lives were really difficult working on the plantations. Some of them worked inside as domestic slaves, so they did household things. And then some of them learned trades. So some of the African slaves were taught to do things like put horseshoes on a horse, or maybe make leather saddles and things like that. Like some of them got to learn a trade, but again, they were not paid for their trade or even respected for their trade. They just got taught the trade so that they could work for the masters. They had few, if any, rights, and a lot of them were mistreated. So Black women were especially vulnerable to being mistreated from their masters. And even though a large majority of the slaves lived in the South, slavery was all over the 13 colonies. So even though there was a lot of slavery in the South, there were no parts of the 13 colonies where slavery didn't exist. Okay, so what was life like for a slave? It was worse than an indentured servant. They had no contract no end date, no promise of freedom. Most of them died on the journey. They had to work long hours, obey their masters. Some of them worked outside on the plantation, some worked inside, and some learned trades. Black women were often mistreated by their masters, and they were all considered property. Slavery existed in all of the colonies, all 13 colonies. So in New England, in the middle colonies, and in the southern colonies, even though most slaves were in the South. Okay, the last part we're going to talk about is Southern women. And you can see on this slide that there's a lot of different ways that Southern women were dressed, and some of the images show women who were more wealthy and some women who were working. So a lot, like we said before, a lot of the people in the South were servants or slaves. Most of the indentured servants were men because they were considered more useful in the fields. So there were way more men than women in the Southern colonies. So in fact, men outnumbered women 5-1, which meant that for every 5 men, there was 1 woman. So this made women servants and slaves very vulnerable to being mistreated by their masters, and women who worked as indentured servants were not allowed to get married until their service was up. So they didn't get that right until they weren't a servant anymore. These two things led to less marriages because indentured servants couldn't get married and there were less women, and fewer children. So because there was less marriages, there were less children being born than other colonies, than the middle colonies and the New England colonies. When they could marry, when the women could marry, they were in high demand. So if you can imagine, if there was 5 men for every 1 woman, all 5 men are not going to be able to marry that woman. So women kind of got their pick of which man they were going to marry. And they didn't really have any trouble finding husbands. But the South had a really high death rate as well because there were so many diseases. So husbands died off. And when they would die, women were allowed to marry again and have a second marriage or even a third marriage. And they often did because there were that many men around. So when a woman who was married had their husband die, they could become a landowner that way. And they could own their property, sell their property. And this was really unusual at the time because women didn't really have that right. But and they still didn't get to vote or anything like that. But they did get that freedom if their husbands died, which happened frequently. So, what was life like for women in the Southern colonies? There were not as many women as men. Men competed to marry women because there were fewer women than men. If a woman was an indentured servant, she couldn't get married and might have been mistreated by her master as well, just like slaves were. And if a woman's husband died from disease or from anything, the woman could then own property if she didn't remarry. And then second and third marriages were very common due to the high death rate from disease. And even with all of this, and with women being so important in the colony, they still couldn't vote or participate in politics in any way. Okay, we are going to end with a short video from Social Studies Weekly. I'm going to try to play this video within my video. And And then you'll have a couple questions on Schoology to answer. And one of those questions includes like, what do you think about living in the Southern Colonies, and what is at least one reason that you would or would not want to live in the Southern Colonies? Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this video.
There were 5 colonies in the South: Georgia, colonists, and even pirates. Oglethorpe spent a lot of money trying to protect his new colony. The Carolinas were a good place to make money growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. They also produced turpentine, olive oil, and even silk. South Carolina was a place of relative religious tolerance and was home to a group of French Protestants called Huguenots. The Huguenots were rich settlers who could not also have many influence of supplies. One theory was Spanish people were very little with the birth of Virginia. All the three were famous Jane Austen. This changed to a hero, so one of the demands is two children. A hero is a second and a son of the hero. One of these sons is son hero, William Adler. Son hero was a West German, but when Adler was born to the American of the West German in the Second Island, the hero ran one of the family systems to live up and was born as the fourth children and normally named son. But one son is the fourth one. The lowlands of the colony were the perfect place for one thing: growing tobacco. As the farms and plantations grew, Virginia started bringing in more African slaves, and leaders now paved the way selling themselves beautiful slaves for pure nails. There were 14 in Philly, and the second college in America was founded there in 1693, the College of William and Mary. All 13 colonies had certain things in common, but there were many things that made the Southern colonies distinct. As time went on, those differences grew even more pronounced, until there was a definite divide in the country. And you can probably guess where those differences led.
Okay, so I want you to go to Schoology now and answer the discussion questions I put on there. And then next week, I will have a video to help you guys prepare for Jeopardy! And we'll be playing Jeopardy! On Tuesday about the Southern Colonies. I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.